The Eugenics Board was there as a kind of safeguard organisation. It was there to make sure that the recommendations for sterilisation that came before it were appropriate. Recommendations were typically made by people associated with institutions where people with disabilities were housed, and those recommendations often came from the director of the institution, so an institution like the Provincial Training School in Red Deer, others at Ponoka and just outside of Edmonton as well. We're also in this position where there would be these sort of internal reviews, or a case would go forward, and the Eugenics Board would look at the case file and meet with the individual. People were recommended for sterilisation typically between the ages of 13 and 20, and a lot of these were cases where the people were between 13 and 15. There were 4,785 cases that were considered, and 99% of them were approved. There was actually not a single refusal of a case. They didn't turn a case back. They turned them back in the sense they deferred on 60 cases. And when those cases, not all of those cases came back, but the ones that did were approved. But it's interesting that only, depending which document you read, 2,822 or 2,832 sterilisations were performed. So over half, but not less than 60% of them were actually performed. And I don't know the answer to the question of what happened in those middle cases. That's actually just part of the picture we don't know. And part of what's motivated me is that there's a lot here to know, just about the historical record, which really has to, I think, inform anything that we want to do in light of this. It's not that we can't have views and form judgments without it, but it's really one of those areas where if you compare our situation epistemically, if you like, to the situation in many jurisdictions, you know, they have access to lots and lots and lots of documents and lots of records, and it's a matter, not a simple matter, it may be a long-term matter, for scholars and others to sit down and work through that material. We do not have that kind of privilege right now, for various reasons that we might talk about in discussion. The Sexual Sterilisation Act was repealed when there was our last change of government in the province in 1972, when the Progressive Conservatives came to power. Pleased to say that my own voting district has recently broken through and made a change here in electing Linda Duncan from the NDP, the one out of 28 people elected who, the sole member who wasn't a member of the Progressive Conservative Party. David King was a young, influential cabinet member, and he's actually somebody that we're working with in this network of people, and he's spoken out at other conferences that I've organised on this. He was the minister who introduced the repeal, but he's very clear that Lougheed was the person who was just kind of morally, repulsed by the Sexual Sterilisation Act, and it was one of the very first things they did. They did it within about 6 weeks of coming into power in 72. After repeal, there was the case that's been mentioned of Leilani Muir, who, after a long sort of struggle, we heard a bit about yesterday at a conference, Families and Memory, that we had downtown, successfully sued the province for wrongful sterilisation and confinement. And the judgment from Madam Justice Veit that we heard referred to in Martin's talk contain quite, you heard one little snippet, but really quite strong language, and unusual language for a judgment like this from a judge. And many interesting things were appended as public documents to that decision, which again was somewhat unusual, which in principle makes them much more readily available than other sorts of court documents would be, provided we can prevail on, for example, the university and the province and the courts to have them released. But we actually think there's real hope of that happening. Part of what happened after Leilani's case was there were about between 800 and 900 cases that were settled by the province out of court. So there was a kind of class action suit. Field law was involved in Leilani's case and also in just over half of these other cases. And we're also working with field law on considering the possibility of getting access to some of that material as well for archival sorts of purposes. You've heard a bit about the McCachran controversy. Doug Walston was very active in psychology, and he's an emeritus there. He now teaches at University of North Carolina. He just moved from Windsor last year, and he has been working with Leilani on getting a book finished, which I am shortly going to read. It is done, and we're going to be looking for a publisher for it that tells her story in more detail. And there was this subcommittee that Martin was a member of that issued this report that you've heard about. So in the university around 2003 or so, a bunch of us started meeting and talking about this. I'm not exactly sure if there was any one cause, but there were people like Harvey Kran and Jana Greco from sociology. Jan is one of the few people who's actually looked in detail at these documents, somebody who wasn't directly involved in the legal cases, and she wrote a PhD thesis on the basis of it. Tim Caulfield and Joel Robertson, Dick, myself and Glenn, and Leslie Cormack when she was here in history, and we've also linked up with, as I said, field law and sterilisation survivors. We formed a group that I chose for its sexy acronym, AIC, the Alberta Consortium on the History of Eugenics, in 2005. If we have a name, we're real. And then we developed this What Sorts network over the last couple of years, as was said, about 80 researchers around this question: what sorts of people should there be? We have a sort of large project, and a few people in this room are involved in it, that operates under that sort of title: what sorts of people should there be, that's interested in a sort of range of different applications, and people can take the question any way they want. And I think it's interesting. What's interesting is to see the links that come up between these sort of independently started sorts of projects once we get talking.